Well, welcome everyone. It's Thursday, October 22nd, a few minutes after 12 noon Eastern Time. My name is Eva Lerner-Lamb. I'm president of Palisades Consulting Group and also a new member of the SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, Met section of New York. And I am vice chair of events. And my colleague on the phone who's running the tech today is Mark Gernavage, and Mark is Senior Automotive Engineer at the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey. And I don't know if Jim Kemp is on, but Jim Kemp, who's sort of past chair of the Met section, decided that it was time, now that we've been in this COVID-19 thing for more than half a year, it was time to just get on with it. So we've instituted this series of brown bag lunch talks. We are launching it today. This is our first one, so thank you for bearing with us on some of the tech glitches. I'm so sorry that we can't see you all. The idea is to gather as if we were at a cafeteria lunch table, having lunch together and having one person talk about what they're interested in, having somebody sort of question them, discuss with them, and then have everybody jump in and get to know each other, find out some information with each other. It's too bad I can't share with you my chocolate chip cookies. They're pretty good. That's what we would be doing if we were live. So welcome. I'm going to just go through some of the house rules for this session. One of them is, and this is the most important one, these are going to be informal. These are brown bag lunches. So in the future, we're going to be able to see each other and we're going to be able to release the microphones. But hey, we dream big, we start small, we learn fast. But throughout, we're going to be informal. We want you to eat your lunch. We don't want you to squeeze in lunch before 12 noon or squeeze in lunch afterwards. We want you to eat lunch during these brown bag sessions. So if you have to be eating while your camera's on, do that. You get a little bit of a free space today because your cameras can't turn on, but I'm going to be eating. All right, and let's see. Okay, how many participants? We have 17 participants. We're expecting something between 20 and 30. And we will be having a survey at the end of this hour. We really would appreciate your comments, your help to try to make this really go. So give us your suggestions on topics and sort of the tech aspects of how we can make this better the next time. And we also invite you to do two things. One, if you like what you are experiencing, we encourage you to join SAE. It's a whole new era, right? Fourth Industrial Revolution and all of that, electric vehicles and all. It's so exciting. And so join SAE so you can keep informed and we can meet each other informally like this. The other thing is you'll be getting a follow-up email thanking you for participating. Feel free to forward that email, which will contain a link to the recording of this lunch, especially to your mentorees, young people who you're trying to bring up through the profession. Please feel free to forward that email to them and encourage them to join the next one. All right, so in developing today's program, the leadership of SAE Met section got together and we tried to figure out what is the most challenging, exciting, and must-do thing that the New York region needs to focus on. And it was pretty clear, it was a no-brainer. We need to figure out electrification of freight, electrification of commercial vehicles. And there's really no one better to present on where we are in the Northeast region with that topic than Ben Mandel. And so we've invited Ben to speak about his efforts at CalSTART, and we invited Denise Mendez, who is at the New York City Department of Transportation, to be the discussant. I'd like to give you a brief review of Ben's qualifications. They are in the email, but for the record, Ben is the Northeast Regional Director of CalStart, and his responsibility is for market acceleration and policy development to advance cleaner and more efficient mobility solutions. I met Ben in 2016, nearly half a decade ago, when he was leading the policy efforts for the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability for Transportation and Policy. And I was so impressed by his worldview and how he was applying his skills and his education and knowledge for the mayor's office. And I was so glad to see that he landed at CalStart so that he can apply his skills, his knowledge and expertise there. Ben has a master's in public policy and energy and resources from UC Berkeley and a bachelor from Brown. And I love the two majors that he majored in at Brown, mathematical economics and Hispanic literature and culture. The discussant for our program today is Denise Mendez. Denise is Director of Freight Mobility at New York City Department of Transportation. She oversees a multi-million-dollar program to advance policies and initiatives on behalf of the city to reduce the adverse effects of trucks on infrastructure and communities, while at the same time improving safety, truck delivery efficiency, and New York City's economic competitiveness. She has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from City College of New York, and she has a Master of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Ben to give his presentation, and everybody on the call, please to enjoy your lunch. Ben?
All right, terrific. Eva, thank you so much for hosting me and inviting me to share a bit about my current work with SAE. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. Also happy to engage in conversation with an old colleague, Denise, and I'm really looking forward to diving into it with her and with all of you. First, let me just confirm that you can see my slideshow okay. Eva, if you want to give a thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay, terrific.
Yes, I can see it, so I'm hoping everybody else can. Everybody, if you check your participants box at the bottom of your Zoom, you should be able, oh no, there's no vote. We'll have to fix that too, Mark. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, but I do want to encourage folks, I can't actively see the Q&A as the presentation's going, but as I say things and you object or have questions, please do feel free to populate the Q&A pod. And that'll help guide the discussion to come afterwards and make sure we're orienting it toward the topics that are most of interest to all of you. So this afternoon, I'm really pleased to talk about commercial vehicle technology, specifically on the fuel and propulsion system side. So we consider commercial vehicles to be anything basically medium and heavy duty or gross vehicle weight rating class 3 through 8 for those fluent in that kind of lexicon. And essentially, what I'm going to share about is our Drive to Zero program, which is essentially our international theory of change for how we can do more to catalyze markets to get from where we currently are, which is a fraction of a percentage of sales being zero emission, even in the most progressive markets, to a future where we're achieving maybe a 30% sales share for zero emission technology within the next decade by 2030. First, I want to give a word of introduction on CalStart. Some of you may know the name, some of you may not know the name and think we're maybe like a California association or government agency. We're not. We're a national clean transportation technology consortium. We're a nonprofit group, and we partner with industry and government. We've got more than 270 member organizations at this point, spanning original equipment manufacturers, automotive suppliers, tier 1 and 2, clean fuel providers, electric vehicle supply equipment, electric vehicle infrastructure partners, utilities, government agencies, and delivery and transit fleets are a very important component of our membership as well. And we engage anywhere the clean transportation value chain could use a little bit of a boost, whether that's on commercialization, policy, or maybe implementing incentive programs. But perhaps what we're best known for is our work to catalyze change in commercial vehicles, so medium and heavy duty. So that's both transit buses, school buses, but also goods movement. And so that's why I'm really pleased to be sharing this kind of digital dais with Denise. And to motivate this problem, I don't think we'll have too much trouble getting buy-in among this group, but trucks in particular represent a really small fraction of on-road transportation in the industrialized world. So we've got about 4% from a recent report by the International Council for Clean Transportation, or ICCT. Yet they represent an outsized share of very harmful human health emissions. So roughly 3/4 of on-road NOx come from this very small share of the on-road population. And what's more, those health exposures, those emissions impacts are borne disproportionately by the groups that are most vulnerable to their impacts. So historically, I've cribbed here from a report I was involved in back in 2016, New York City's roadmap to 80 by 50, to demonstrate that the more impoverished a census tract or a community is, the more likely they are to face higher particulate exposures and therefore to face the most adverse health impacts from those emissions. So it's not an across the board issue. This is an issue that gets worse for the most vulnerable communities. In recognition of some of these dynamics, CalSTART in 2018 launched a new global campaign called the Global Commercial Vehicle Drive to Zero program. So this is a multi-stakeholder initiative where we try to bridge public and private sector partners to accelerate positive outcomes in terms of commercial vehicle electrification or decarbonization. And it really revolves around two central pillars. In 2025, we want to ensure that near and zero emission commercial vehicles are cost competitive and commercially viable in their first success, or what we call beachhead applications, in global early mover regions. These applications are basically those that I'll describe more in a moment. It's where electrification is most likely to succeed. By 2040, we want to make sure that zero emission technologies are sales dominant. So a sales share of 80% or more for new vehicle sales in these dominant regions of the world, again, by 2040. And really our strategic theory of change here is that by collaborating to bring about regional ecosystems where these first success or beachhead applications for zero emission tech can thrive and grow, that in fact those technologies can not only develop scale, but they can also expand and penetrate into more heavier duty, more difficult to electrify applications as the technology matures and expands. So guiding this transformation is what we call the Beachhead Strategy. And the Beachhead Strategy recognizes that zero emission commercial vehicle technology isn't going to roll out everywhere all at once. So when I'm talking about electric buses and trucks, it's not the case that we expect or are even advocating for jurisdictions to adopt the Tesla Semi everywhere now, right? There needs to be a phased and sequenced transition to recognize where the technology landscape is positioned now and how it needs to be sequenced to achieve the growth we aim to see over time. So those beachhead applications are these kind of first 1 or 2 waves of technology development, where maybe there are shorter duty cycles, fixed route service, and back to base operations that can more predictably and reliably be supported by maybe electric vehicle charging infrastructure, maybe hydrogen refilling infrastructure, depending on the type of zero emission technology being used. Generally, we find that transit buses are a great example of that kind of beachhead application. There's a lot of, first of all, public sector control over procurement for transit buses. And the technology is also really well established at this point. The duty cycle is highly conducive. That technology can also be ported over into kind of wave 2 technologies, which are things like school buses, which we can kind of think of as mini transit buses, and even urban goods movement. So as we think about last mile delivery, this is another duty cycle that is extremely conducive, especially in really dense areas like New York, to electrification, because the duty cycles are so small, so short. As volumes grow in these early success applications, battery costs should come down, local supply chains should emerge, and then those supply chains are transferable to other types of platforms that go longer distances and rely more heavily on heavier duty battery packs, for instance, until by say the mid 2020s, we are viably electrifying longer distance duty cycles like regional haul. So my team at CalSTART is tracking progress in commercialization for where the market is with releasing these types of products to market. And we found that at the end of last year, there were already nearly 100 products that are commercially available in North America, the US and Canada, across medium and heavy duty platforms. We expect that number to jump almost to double by the end of this year. And that's even after kind of adjusting for a bit of slowdown and some reshuffling of plans due to the COVID pandemic. And then we do expect a doubling from the 2019 number by the end of next year. And if we look across commercial vehicle platforms, we see the Beachhead strategy playing out in real time. So if you looked at the numbers from year-end 2019, the leading platform in terms of model availability was transit bus, which we see as that beachhead technology segment, again, that's most conducive to electrification in the near term, where we're based now. As things proceed, and even in the course of 2020, we're seeing volumes really shoot up in that last mile goods movement segment. What really stands out here is medium duty trucks, but that's just one of the segments where urban last mile delivery is constituted. There's also cargo vans and medium duty step vans that have pretty healthy volumes as well. A lot of the activity we see in medium duty truck, it's a little difficult to make an apples to apples judgment because we see a lot of manufacturers that are actually upfitters. So they can basically install a very versatile electric drive system into any number of permutations of other manufacturers' equipment. So companies like Motive and Lightning Systems and C Electric really have a ton of different models that are available within that medium duty truck segment, which helps to kind of inflate that number a bit. And this checks out with what we're reading in the news, right? We've read about the 100,000 vehicle order that Amazon has placed with Michigan-based startup Rivian. You may have heard about the 10,000 vehicle order that UPS has placed with a UK-based company that's establishing routes in North America called Arrival. FedEx has placed an order for 1,000 change panel vans in California through that incentive program. IKEA has committed to 100% zero-emission home deliveries in globally by 2025 and in 5 leading metro areas, including New York by the end of this year. And just last month, we were really pleased to see a European-based company called Volta introduce a brand new concept in urban goods movement. It's a purpose-built zero-emission vehicle designed exclusively for the purpose of delivering goods over that last mile in modern cities, first in Europe, next in the entire world. So what do we need to do as a New York ecosystem, as a Northeast region, to make sure we are sending the right market signals to attract innovation, to allow fleets to innovate and to adopt these technologies confidently, and to let them know that really this region is open for business? Well, we've kind of seen that there's sort of a toolkit that needs to be applied to create that ecosystem for success when it comes to zero-emission commercial vehicles, some of which are already present in New York. But generally, we consider these elements to be vehicle incentives to aid in the purchase and recognize that these trucks and buses still cost quite a bit more than the conventional diesel counterparts, making sure that there is adequate infrastructure development and investment to go along with those vehicle incentives. And we can talk more about that matching in a moment. There's also the notion of creating voluntary or mandatory zero-emission zones for delivery vehicles. So not too dissimilar to how New York City revolutionized Times Square not too long ago by pedestrianizing it. Can we employ some of the innovation that European cities in particular have introduced by banning diesel in certain segments or introducing low or zero emission zones for that last mile segment in particular? There's also the notion going a step further to where California has just gone of introducing sales mandates. Manufacturer impose requirements for progressively greater zero emission sales shares starting in 2024 and going to 2040 under a regulation called the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. Along with that, if you're going to put a manufacturer requirement in place, it also really helps to make sure that fleets, the purchasers, are required to make progressively greater procurements within zero-emission technology as well, making sure that the market exists and that you're not just putting an unreasonable supply side mandate in place. So I mentioned that we already have some of these items in motion here in New York State. I want to highlight one such program, the New York Truck Voucher Incentive Program, run by NYSERDA. My team at CalSTART is a contractor to NYSERDA, and we help get the word out about available incentives statewide with a particular emphasis on environmental justice communities. And you can see here, there's funding available for a range of fuel types and vehicle technologies. So the first block is for on-road trucks, class 4 to 8. There's also really robust funding available for transit buses under the Volkswagen settlement that New York State is dispersing. And then finally, we still have funding available through the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program that New York State DOT administers using FHWA funding for a lot of miscellaneous vehicle types, or like school buses that are not yet provided for under the VW settlement, but will be soon. So this is just one example. I know New York City, maybe Denise can touch on this. New York City has a complementary program called the New York City Clean Trucks Program for vehicles that are either domiciled in or doing substantial business in one of the industrial business zones in New York City. So in those cases, those truck fleets would just take their incentives from New York City instead of New York State. So these programs work together very nicely, and they help address that first cost barrier. New York State has also just approved a massive make-ready program to help get that infrastructure component better calibrated as well. So New York State has approved more than $15 million to complement vehicle incentives through either the New York Truck Voucher Incentive Program or the New York City program, so that fleets taking delivery of new zero-emission equipment, or electric equipment in particular, don't have to bear the entire cost of the utility bringing adequate electrical service, maybe making transformer upgrades further upstream in their system, which is really prohibitive. So this should be very beneficial when it comes to the total cost of ownership calculation that fleets will be making when weighing whether or not they can afford to go zero emission today or in the near term. So finally, I just want to end with a really positive and encouraging note, which is that New York is a party to a really impressive multi-state collaboration that was agreed to in July. New York was one of 15 states plus DC to agree to a memorandum of understanding right after California enacted their advanced clean trucks rule. That basically commits these states to work collaboratively to develop actions that will get us on track to 100% zero emission sales for medium and heavy duty by 2050, with an interim target of 30% by 2030. So they will be developing an action plan over the course of the next year, with a draft plan developed and circulated for stakeholder feedback probably in the early part of 2021. We're on a stakeholder advisory council for that effort, so we hope to get it pointed in the right direction and to achieve good engagement with the industry. But there's this really important question begging to be asked, which is, we're talking about 30% sales share by 2030. We're well under 1% currently, even in New York, where we have a lot of these pieces in place. So we need really bold actions and market signals to start even getting on a different trajectory where 30 by 30 becomes a plausible reality. So what are the things we need to be doing to get there? And that's the subject of, fortunately, a lot of attention and a lot of energy that I think will be coming into this industry now, but hopefully for the next coming years as well. So why don't I pause there? I want to thank everyone for the attention. Hopefully there have been some questions that have come into the chat, and I look forward to discussion with Denise.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great presentation, and the presentation will also be available in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out. So you'll be getting all of those. You'll be getting all that information. And now I just want to clarify that the Q&A box, I'm hopeful that you can use the Q&A box. I'm not able to access it because I've been designated a panelist. But if your Q&A box is not working, then go ahead and ask your question in the chat box. and direct your question to Denise. All right, and now Denise, would you please go ahead and discuss?
Sure. Thank you so much, Eva. Ben, this was a really great presentation, and I think right off the bat that, you know, it's really promising to see that, you know, many other regions, states are jumping on to the bandwagon here, particularly as California has always led the way in many of these forward-thinking strategies. So in many ways, you know, what are some of the top priority policy actions that you think that New York State, as well as other municipalities like New York City, can explore to create and incentivize the larger adoption of commercial vehicles and for zero-emission commercial vehicles?
Yeah, it's an important question, because as far along as New York State and City are in leading this region, others are making definitive moves. We're talking about incentive programs being introduced specifically for zero-emission trucks and buses, potentially in New Jersey, potentially in Massachusetts, and a lot of other really exciting developments in the region. So what we want to see is to make sure that New York maintains its leadership foothold. And there are a few areas that I think still present themselves as kind of low-hanging fruit in that regard. The one I would really point to is at the state level. You know, when it comes to things like utility regulation, I mentioned the new Make-Ready investment approval that was issued by the Public Service Commission in New York in July. On aggregate, that's a $700 million approval, by the way, with just a small share going toward medium and heavy duty vehicles. So I do want to commend the state's utility regulator for recognizing the imperative of an active utility role in this space. The one area that we haven't seen as much progress on in New York is on what we refer to as rate design. So recognizing that for the time being, the preeminent fuel type when it comes to zero emission is likely to be battery electric technology. That means you're using electricity instead of diesel. And accordingly, you know, fleet operators are pretty rational economic actors, kind of like engineers, right? And they are very responsive and receptive to the price signals that they're subject to as they refuel their new technology, or even simulate what it would be like to own and operate technology that runs on electricity. So I think what we need to see, and what we've seen in other jurisdictions is a need to avoid here, is a larger scale phase-in of zero-emission technology for things like transit authorities and maybe large logistics companies that want to electrify maybe an entire depot, but are too hesitant to do so because of massive demand charges that they would be exposed to as commercial and industrial customers. So more willingness to moderate and modify rate design on the basis of, you know, cost neutral approaches that can better represent marginal decision making that fleets can make to optimize the costs that they impose on the system and can improve their total cost of ownership equation. That's on the state side. I'd say on the city side, we would love to work with the city on exploring maybe voluntary solutions that can help get towards some of the outcomes that a lot of European leaders have achieved. So I know from looking at a lot of legal assessments that things like legal low emissions or zero emission zones face significant legal headwinds in US cities. But looking at what the city, for instance, can control, like curb access, parking pricing, green loading zones, things like that, may be able to have an outsized impact in shaping fleet decision-making as they look for any marginal inducement or deterrent to the use of diesel technology and exploring new technology. So those are a few of the levers we think could be at play in New York City and state.
That's a pretty exhaustive list. I would say that I see Susan McSherry is here. She's my colleague, and from New York City DOT. She heads up the alternative fuels program here at New York City Department of Transportation. But earlier this year in June, we actually launched the expansion of the New York City Clean Truck Program, which was formerly the Hunts Point Clean Truck Program, which replaced over 600 dirtier, polluting trucks with newer trucks, higher emission standards. The new Clean Truck Program, I think, gives rebates ranging from $12,000 up to $185,000, depending on the fuel type, truck class size. But there's a huge proponent in that for driving like electric vehicles, et cetera. So we are, I think, moving in that direction, and it's a huge environmental justice component, particularly with industrial business zones throughout the city, in areas that there are land use conflicts with populations that are either low income or minority populations as well. So this is not just about the environment, the environmental emissions, but also the impact to the quality of life and for the less advantaged populations here in the city. So there was a question, I think, in the chat box by Brian Park. He said, great talk. Just wanted to know about any other governmental policies or incentives from state and or federal to promote this, particularly pointing to the EU and other countries. Do you have a sense of any other elements that have been used to overcome some of those legal challenges that you've pointed out earlier? One of the things that comes to mind for me is interstate commerce clause.
Yeah.
And that has had a huge impact, particularly within the US.
Yeah, interstate commerce is one of the potential sticking points. I mean, this should be self-evident because as I bumble my way through this explanation, I am not a lawyer. But, you know, we've worked with lawyers, people have looked into this. So in addition to kind of Clean Air Act and Commerce Clause regulations, there's Federal Aviation Administration language that also, you know, prevents non-federal jurisdictions from doing anything to impact freight routes. So there are any number of avenues to explore that, you know, might pose legal challenges. And I connected not too long ago with Amy Turner, who's a legal scholar at Columbia, who explored some of these pathways to kind of low and zero emission zones in US cities, making some arguments for ways that we can navigate them. I think one logical way to look at this that frankly European cities just don't have to contend with. I think they do have a little more latitude on the municipal level, especially because there's cities within countries and then a broader European Union that is, the governance is just different. But we see LA, I think Santa Monica right now looking into voluntary programs where, you know, teams like Denise's have very close working relationships with freight providers. If we can, you know, forge good working relationships and get voluntary buy-in and explore what incentives may be needed, you know, around the margins that maybe state programs can be called upon to provide, or even federal grants from Department of Energy as an example, we can start to build kind of an ecosystem where we understand how various components and levers play together. And that's why I mentioned things like rationing curb access, assigning green loading zones. I know DOT has had an off-hour delivery pilot going at various points in time over recent years, just thinking differently about how we handle the status quo, how these operators, you know, are used to operating, and how the newer technology can be integrated into their operations as painlessly as possible, which means making it easier financially and operationally. The other kind of best practice I'd point to is a low carbon fuel standard. California is probably the best known jurisdiction for introducing that, but this is just another way to effectively monetize the low carbon nature of zero emission fuel types, but other, you know, maybe near zero emission fuel types as well, including renewable fuels like renewable natural gas, biodiesel and renewable diesel also have a role in this type of policy. And it allows them to better compete on a level playing field with the incumbent fuel, which is diesel. So things that help, you know, both the capital cost, as we've discussed with vehicle incentives and infrastructure, investment, but then also support on the operating side. Again, it always comes back to total cost of ownership. We can't really rely on leading fleets to just do these things out of charity. It needs to make financial sense for them, and policy needs to shape the conditions to make it so.
Have you seen for the cities, or well, specifically talking about the West Coast, I think we're seeing a lot more progress there. Have you seen any movement as it relates to the city environment and any additional measures that they've put in place for some of the things that you've mentioned, like loading zones, et cetera?
It's a live topic. There's no question. We, in fact, are working with a number of other NGO partners on a campaign to basically work with leading cities throughout the country in a range of, in a variety of regions, so that it's not, can't just say, okay, this is a California solution. We want to explore some of those variations, and kind of like a way C40 tends to work with some leading cities to better understand, what implementation items are possible in various jurisdictions. I think there's more interest right now in some of the typical leaders like LA, Seattle, maybe the Bay Area. We would love to make sure that New York is one of those kind of pilot cities, especially as congestion pricing continues to perhaps work its way through and get federal authorization. One of the things we're closely tuned to is we really are supportive of congestion pricing as a way to send the right price signal and right-sized vehicle activity. But boy, it would be really nice if we also leverage that opportunity to send the right price signal to fleets operating commercial vehicles that, of course, they're still vehicles, they still cause congestion, but they impose lower externalities as compared to diesel counterparts. So some other way maybe of tolling or internalizing their lower externality costs as opposed to diesel vehicles would be a real big win.
Okay. I think that's a huge part of that, is just really thinking of that, there's really not a one size fits all, but it's more of a complementary set of solutions that can really work together more harmoniously. You touched on this a little bit, but I want to just dig a little bit deeper on the issues as it relates to like smaller fleet and their ability to be able to penetrate or kind of that market. We understand that the procurement and all the other elements may be a lot easier for the larger fleet, but what are some ways that you think that we can overcome that, particularly within the trucking industry? I think about 80% of the independent owner operators, have like maybe a smaller fleet, like maybe 2 or 3 vehicles or more, or just about, and their revenue margins, are significant. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's a thin margin business to start. And of course, we're in a recession now, and a lot of people's livelihoods are being impacted. So those economic hardships are starker than ever. And what we're realizing is that even in the jurisdictions where we're working alongside state partners to introduce things like vehicle incentives to try to do the right thing, it's not getting as deep into the market as we want it to. We being the industry and society. It's really important that from an equity perspective and to make sure that those environmental benefits are really accruing in environmental justice areas, that we address smaller fleets, as you're pointing out, Denise. So it's important to recognize that a lot of those smaller fleets really are never trying to access the primary market for new trucks to begin with. So one of the things we're looking at, and hopefully have an opportunity to work with partners to introduce here in New York City and state, would be full service lease models that better recognize the way these smaller fleets tend to operate and tend to procure their vehicles, and recognize that they have lower kind of headroom to do some of the infrastructure preparation and procurement that is required of switching fuel types. So if we can introduce them to a turnkey solution that better, takes care of all of the bundled cost of procuring, operating, maintaining the vehicle. I think that'll be a better way to integrate smaller operators to begin with. And then making sure that we have product available in a secondary market that is cleaner and allows for them to contribute to environmental improvement, right? So both the New York State and the city programs right now require vehicle scrappage of a 2009 or older diesel engine to make sure that those vehicles are demonstrably taken out of service. So it's taking the oldest, worst offenders off the roads. And that's a really good thing. Who has a lot of those types of vehicles are these smaller fleets. So we need to figure out a way collaboratively to kind of bridge that gap and make sure that, maybe they can take possession of the newer vehicles that some of these fleets who are really excited about new trucks are eager to offload and exchange their scrap to compensate for a newer vehicle's acquisition. Mm-hmm. Thinking outside the box to make sure we're being more inclusive of those smaller fleets is going to be a critical path item to make sure that as we're trying to get to 30% sales, we're not leaving smaller fleets in the dust.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, that's helpful. I think that's going to be a huge part of making this work for everyone, big and small. We've heard issues in the past about the implications or impacts of trade, the trade wars of sorts, Buy Back America, and other things. Have you seen any impacts as it relates to the manufacturing of these vehicles and bringing that to market based on any of these external factors or disruptors, even COVID?
COVID's definitely slowed down production schedules and in some cases, new product launches. But I've been really encouraged by what we continue seeing. I'll give an example. We did a Climate Week event on Drive to Zero, along with our partners at Series at the end of September. And we featured a speaker from Navistar, so the parent company of International Trucks. And he was talking very excitedly about their new e-mobility production facility in Texas, in San Antonio, and that they're going full steam ahead, and that the first truck that'll roll off the production line in 2021 is going to be a battery electric truck. So, those volumes keep picking up. I think if we start to see a more definitive signal at the federal level that says, we recognize that the future is zero emission, then companies will get the message and start to locate more of their production and supply chain relationships domestically. Right now, it's difficult to meet some of the FTA requirements, or I should say the FHWA, Buy America domestic content requirements, which are 100%. We think at best it's difficult to substantiate whether or not a vehicle is entirely American made, just because it's a really complicated piece of machinery. However, we know that there is a lot of appetite and expertise among tier 1 and 2 suppliers located in the US. So we think that, if we just get a little more of a nudge at the federal level, we can start to see, fully Buy America compliant equipment and have the US be a leader on zero emission production.
That would be awesome. So I think we're going to be opening it up to the larger audience for an open mic. But I think there were 2 questions in the queue, but I wanted to kind of lead with. David Brass asked a question. We talk a lot about incenting vehicle purchase. Has there been work to incentivize charging stations or charging costs for fleets? Thank you, David, for the great question.
Agreed. Thank you, David. I would say it's been a mixed bag to date. In the California program we work on, which is very similar to the New York incentive programs we've discussed, we tried for a time giving basically a bonus for zero emission infrastructure to accompany the purchase of a new zero emission vehicle. And that actually caused some coordination issues based on very different timing for infrastructure commissioning, vehicle production and delivery. And it also caused that money to be spent faster. And now that program called HVIP is oversubscribed and has been out of funds for the last year or so. Here in New York, though, I think we're taking a smart approach. I would love to see the dollar amounts assigned to infrastructure costs be greater, but I think we've taken a really nice step in the right direction with this July Public Service Commission order I discussed, where the utilities now have authorization from their regulator to invest up to $15 million in the make-ready infrastructure. So that's things like transformer upgrades, substation upgrades if needed, trenching and conduit to extend the necessary electrical service to, say, a fleet facility where that fleet is trying to introduce, you know, a new set of zero-emission or all-electric vehicles. That, you know, those costs at times can dwarf the cost of just a new charging pedestal. So it's really great to see that the state has recognized this, identified that utilities can be a really important provider in establishing that kind of EV infrastructure and ecosystem. And then hopefully we just benefit from scale, where we start to see larger electric fleets placing larger orders for the chargers themselves, as well as charge management solutions that can help them right size the amount of infrastructure that's needed to achieve an electric fleet.
Wonderful. I think that's a great suggestion. Eva, do you want to cue the open mic?
Sure. Thank you both. Ben, terrific presentation, and Denise, thanks for asking Ben some very challenging questions. I think we also got some very good questions from the people who are attending. I see that Mike McEwen has asked a question that I'm very curious about, and then I would like to invite other people to jump in. I think there's a way to raise your hand. If you raise your hand, we'll call on you and you can have an open mic for a couple of minutes. Mike's question is, Ben, what do you think will be the more dominant technology, battery electric or fuel cells?
Yeah, I think there will be a role for both, certainly. But I think everything we're seeing right now would indicate that the larger market share will be battery electric vehicles for the foreseeable future. And perhaps an overly simplistic way to look at it is, we know what electric vehicle infrastructure looks like because we have massive electricity distribution systems in place already. It's just a question of maybe adding more service or at high levels of penetration, more capacity to the system. No small feat.
No.
But still within the realm of our current engineering understanding. When it comes to hydrogen dispensing and fueling infrastructure, we're talking about maybe a more complicated permitting regimen, as well as larger siting footprint requirements, right? There are large stations that are still, you know, under development, even in the Bronx, I believe, out on Long Island as well, in Hempstead, and all on the 95 corridor that have been introduced by a combination of partners, including Toyota, who's trying to sell a hydrogen fuel cell car, the Mirai, and Air Liquide, their fuel systems partner. But these are really large sites. They take up a good deal of room. I would say they bear the most promise when it comes to the really heavy duty side, kind of Class 8 over-the-road transportation, because those vehicles are more used to those types of fueling patterns, and hydrogen fuel cell systems can go longer distances than battery electric technology can currently accommodate. So that's where we see most of the potential, especially as a corridor fueling strategy. I think for more depot-based or urban operation patterns, we're going to see BEV technologies dominate.
So I think the challenge there is negotiating those rates from the electric utilities companies. Not an easy task. Not an easy task. So I'm experiencing some tech problems. I can't see anybody's hands raised. I apologize for not being able to do that. If you have a question that you'd like to ask Ben or Denise, please unmute yourself, because I can see your mute buttons. Anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Or if you have an experience you'd like to share with us, maybe a frustrating experience that you've encountered. In particular, I'd like to hear about some experiences from infrastructure folks, people who are in charge of putting in charging infrastructure. Does anybody have a story they can share with us? I know there are a few people from college campuses on the line, a few people from some city DOTs. Anybody able to share some experiences with us? Or maybe negotiating for utilities rates, electricity rates, time of day charging, that kind of thing. Nobody willing to do that. All right. Well, we still have a few minutes. I'm going to jump. Oh, wait, Michael. Michael, do you have a question or an experience to share? Michael?
Hello. Bob Martinez.
Hi, Michael.
Here.
Bob Martinez.
Hi, Bob.
Hello, Bob.
Hi.
Go ahead.
So we have a little dilemma here. We just are in the process of getting 48 charging stations installed, fast charging stations. And now with the financial situation, the city, we're basically told we're not going to be allowed to buy vehicles for the next 24 months. So how does that play into the realm? And, with government supposed to be the leaders in this situation of converting to electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles, this 24-month delay in purchasing vehicles for the entire city, how's that going to play with the manufacturers?
Sorry, where are you from?
New York City Police Department, NYPD.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. And your name?
Bob Martinez, Deputy Commissioner Martinez, NYPD.
Thanks very much, Bob. Ben?
Yeah, no, it's a tough situation. And Bob, it's really nice to hear from you again. It's been a while.
Yes.
Certainly it's terrific to hear about the ability to install more charging stations. I know that's been a big need for the city fleet for years, right? The city fleet has grown its EV penetration by leaps and bounds in recent years, and the only rate limiting factor has been where to plug these vehicles in. Certainly, Bob made a good point, which is as we're trying to send the right signal to the industry, to manufacturers and suppliers, cities, state fleets, public entities, public transit, have the ability to purchase the type of volume that can really send a signal and help bring costs down more quickly. When we drop this, commercialization roadmap, it does not anticipate COVID, right? So every city is in a different position, but most of them are probably in pretty dire straits when it comes to budgets. So, you can only do what you can do. I would say that there are really encouraging emerging financing models on the horizon where, we can help remove, not we, but some of our partners can help remove some of that first cost burden to fleets and create kind of all-in-one turnkey products where you pay over time out of the operating budget for the procurement, operation, charging, and maintenance of electric vehicle fleets. We're aligned with a number of those companies. If that's a conversation that you or your team would be interested in hearing more about, see what products they offer in a way that might offer a bit of a workaround on the capital cost side. I don't know if Denise has any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I imagine that other city agencies like ourselves are probably in the similar boat as it relates to procurement and the budget constraints that we've faced. So I don't really have much more to add, to be honest.
I'd like to add just a note on that. Whatever the timeline is that infrastructure project managers inform operating agencies that it will take to install charging infrastructure, you sort of have to multiply that timeline by 3 to 5. So if you don't expect to be able to buy your vehicles for another 24 months, you're probably already a year behind in terms of getting the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure in place. So if you've got some momentum on that charging infrastructure, just keep at that. It's going to be a lot faster for you to buy the vehicles than it is to install the charging infrastructure. Thanks for the great question, Bob. I see it's 59. And wow, the hour went really fast for me. I hope everybody got a lot out of the hour besides your lunch. And I'm going to remind everybody that we would really appreciate it if you would answer the survey that Mark is going to put up on your screens before you sign off. And look for the email follow-up that's going to contain a copy of Ben's presentation and a recording of this whole hour. And please do consider joining SAE Med Section, as well as SAE, the mothership, and look for other invitations to join us in the future at future brown bag sessions. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a safe and healthy day.